No, she didn't want to be on camera licking this yogurt. I met another guy called Gumby, and he and MOZAZ eventually ended up sharing a squatted block in Claywood, which is a series of 3 skyscrapers that were built at the back of the station. And those buildings, they seemed to be going up quite quickly, and they were sort of decent homes for working people, in fact. But by the time MOZAZ and Gumby were squatting these flats, the idea of decent homes for working people seems to have sort of somehow gone off the agenda. And so essentially they think anyone who lives in high-rise is a sort of moron, or a sort of scrounger, or, you know, someone who is definitely not one of them. And the one of them includes pretty much all of the political class. MOZAZ had weird theories about these council blocks. When I discussed this sort of thing with him, he would say, oh well, the council really wants to get rid of those blocks, so they're going to fill them up with junkies and problem tenants. Then they'll have the excuse to blow them up. And indeed, around about 2001, when Osama bin Laden was blowing up the New York skyscrapers, many English councils had their own system of blowing up skyscrapers. And indeed, when the Claywood Gardens were, or the Claywood flats were sort of going into their decline, I witnessed this with MOZAZ and his friend Gumby, because Gumby was squatting there while he was doing a Chinese course at Sheffield, and MOZAZ was in with him. And at the time, the other guy, Gumby, was always sort of accusing MOZAZ of stealing his record collection or something like that. So it was clear that, you know, MOZAZ was a very hard person to live with. Anyway, following on from their squatting, the people, or the authorities, then closed all of these flats, and they put these sort of steel gates over the flats, which is very common when they're about to demolish flats. Or sometimes they do it when there's had a fire in a flat, or there's been a police raid in a flat, or a murder in a flat, or something like that. All of these things happen on council estates. And then these flats in Claywood, as the tenants left or got decanted, they put up the steel shutters. And then towards that time, MOZAZ and his friend Gumby and another guy, they decided to sort of occupy one of these flats and to squat there. And I remember going up, and I didn't really have a working battery in my camera at the time, so I did a sketch of them sort of standing in this balcony with all of these police and council officials around, trying to do this sort of eviction. There weren't really sort of any press people there, but there was a small crowd, I suppose. I was one of them. And that was the sort of, you know, big set-piece eviction type of scenario. And MOZAZ seems to love these things. I mean, he also squatted a place which is fairly near to the transformer down here. And that was just a car park, and then a sort of industrial unit, big garage, a sort of go-down or whatever. And he was occupying the living or the office part of that, and he'd got a sleeping bag and some electricity and a computer, and he actually wanted to hold raves or sort of, you know, discotheques there, fundraising for sort of anarchist causes or that sort of thing, or publicity of MOZAZ. MOZAZ was always keen to be the first person to install sound systems somewhere, even if it was from a barrow and a couple of loudspeakers, and then, you know, punk music of some sort. So, several squats later, they put on the steel doors of, well, they put on the steel doors of all of the flats at Claywood. But there was a certain stage in the life of these buildings when the steel doors were more valuable than the building itself, because the building was going to be demolished. So then they started taking off these steel doors, and for a few months those buildings were open for urban exploration. And I was living at Park Hill that time, and I explored all of the 3 blocks on different times in the evenings. But one time I went with Moses and Andy, and we went into the middle block, and we did the whole thing from the sort of floor to the ceiling, or the top to the bottom, and we tried to look in all of the flats just to see what they were. And I collected 1 or 2 letters actually, because I wanted to see what sort of traffic was going through those doors. I know it's illegal, but I learned quite a bit. One room, we came along and we found a coffin in this room, and Moses and Andy were sort of standing back, and I was the one who said, I'm going to lift the lid of that coffin and see what's inside anyway, and I did, and there was nothing. Another time we saw a wheelchair, or sort of expensive drawing board and equipment, bedding. Many of the beds could be slept in, and then in one room there was about 50 or 60 syringes there, all sort of with the needles sort of pointing all over the place. And we took 1 or 2 photos of that. That was sort of junkie hell, the sort of thing that people would say, oh well, of course you can't have council tower blocks when people are going to do that there. So the junkie hell picture was a really good one. And then again, some of those pictures are on my website, because when Moses had the camera, sometimes I'd sort of try and get the card or whatever and sort of get hold of the pictures so I could sort of download them all. Yeah, as I say, Moses had a better camera than me in those days.